Let's make a VR game together, and in this new episode we are going to make our game come to life by adding a narrative story using a timeline.
Grab and use the disintegrator.
As always, feel free to subscribe down below for the next episode about adding a start menu to our game. And if you'd like to support my work and get access to the Result Unity project, I will leave in the description my Patreon. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so now at this point, here are the interactions that I want the player to perform in order. 1. Grab and throw the small asteroid in the trash can. 2. Break the big asteroid with the gun. 3. Analyze the energy cube. 4. Open the door and go to the control room. And finally 5. Navigate the spaceship to the vortex. And in this episode, we'll make our game come to life by adding a meaning to all of these interactions with a story and some narration. So, before recording these tutorials, I wrote this little text. You can pause if you want to read the complete story. Then I generated from this text 8 voice lines. And as you can see, I've already imported these 8 voice lines in this game. And of course, you will be able to download them as well and add it to your own project with the link you will find in the description. Now, anyway, the big question is, how can we link the narration with the action of our game? And for this project, I'm going to share with you my little secret on how to do so with a timeline. So let me show you. Now, a timeline is basically like doing a video editing. Now, if we go to Windows, Package Manager, then go in Project, you should see by default the timeline already imported in the project. Otherwise, you can search for them in the Unity registry and add them like we've done previously on this series. Now, anyway, to add a timeline to our game, let's right-click, create an empty game object that we can rename Narrative Story. There we go. We can recenter this empty game object and add a playable director. There you go. Now we can go to Windows, Sequencing, and here we should see Timeline. It should add this timeline window that I like to drag next to the game windows. And as you can see, it is asking us to add a timeline asset. So let's click on Create. We can keep the narrative story timeline name and click on Save. And there you go, now our timeline is already set up. So in my case, I'm going to drag the first voice line over there. And by default, as you can see, this has already added a timeline element, which is of type audio source here. And that will be able to play the first voice line. As you can see, if I select the first frame and press on play.
Day 117, we are still stuck in this space void. According to our calculations, the food reserves will allow you to survive for another 15 hours. Good luck.
And here it is, you should be able to hear the first timeline, so let's add the other. Okay, so now that we have all the voice lines that are representing the different steps of our game over there, the really cool thing that we can do with the timeline is to also enable or disable some objects. Just to show you a quick example, in the first part of the story, I want here the little asteroid to spawn. Now, what we can do is enable the first asteroid to show it to the player after the first voice line is played. And we can also do the same with the big asteroid afterwards. To do so, I'm going to just to navigate more easily, lock the timeline windows. We can then select our space waste small right there, and we can simply drag it over there on this left side of the timeline and select Add Activation Track. Now, as the name suggests, an activation track will make sure that the space waste mode is activated within here the time that is shown. So you can take a side and kind of drag it to where you want the object to start appearing. Or on the other end, you can drag this other side to kind of make the object disappear. Now, in my case, I want the activation of the space waste mode to go from the third voice line and go all the way here till the start of the fourth voice line. Now, this will make sure that, as you can see, if I change here the timeline, this will make sure that the asteroid will only show when the voice line here is played, and it will disappear when the next voice line will get started. Now, anyway, we can do the same for the big asteroid. So we can drag here the spaceways breakable in the left side again, add activation. And there you go. We can do the same. So here, in my case, I'm making sure that the spaceways breakable is spawning at the correct time for the voice assistant number 4 here that we have, and will disappear when we start the next voice line. Now, a next thing that is really cool with the timeline is that you can actually trigger some action as well from the timeline. So, for example, in my case, I want the button to be pushable here and to open the door only after we have snapped the energy cube on the socket interactor over there. And according to my timeline, this is happening on the 6th voice line.
Congratulations, you found a new energy source. According to my calculation, that's enough to power the beer cooler or restart the engines, your choice. Doors unlocked.
And so to do so, we can right click here and click on signal track. There you go. And then right click again and add signal emitter. Now, as you can see, we need to create a signal. So let's click on create signal and I'm going to call it door unlock. Beautiful. But as you can see, the track has no bound game object. So the bound game object is basically a game object in your scene that will have a signal receiver component. Now, in my case, I want here the push button to have this. So let's add a component and add the signal receiver component. We can add as the reaction, select here the door unlocked, and we can then drag the signal receiver over there. Now the last step is to say what happens when the door is unlocked. And in my case, I'm going to click here on the plus button. We can then drag the push button over there and then go to the button push open door and then enable equals true. And there you go. Now, if we disable the button push open door function, this will make sure that the script that is responsible to open the door on the push of this button will happen only when this signal has emitted in our timeline. Okay, so far we've seen 3 things with the timeline: how to add audio, how to enable or disable objects, and how to trigger custom function from this timeline. But another cool thing is that you can also animate an object from the timeline. And let me show you how. So for example, here I have here the vortex. And one thing that could be cool is that only when the players enters this zone, the vortex will scale up. And in my case, I want to do this kind of behavior over there. So let's hear it.
Reach the space teleportator ahead. As you forgot to use the plasma molecular magnetic chocolate shield, avoid the asteroid or you will die.
Okay, so to animate any object within the timeline, what we can do is drag the object in question, which is the vortex here on the left, and add an animation track. There we go. So in my case, I want the animation to start over there at the start of the voice line. And then what we can do is click here on the record button. And in my case, I'm going to scale down this vortex to 0, 0, 0. And then go a little further into the timeline. And here we can set the new scale of the vortex, which was 8 on all axes, I believe. And there we go. Now, if we right click and convert to clip track, and then finally end the recording, we should have a beautiful animation for our vortex to scale up.
Reach the space teleportator ahead.
And there you go. Now we've seen a lot of different behavior that we can do with the timeline. And what's even fascinating is that you can see all of this behavior at any point within just one Unity windows, which I think is really cool because you can basically have a direct understanding of all the components and all of the story within your game in the same way that you would in a video editing software. But of course, right now, all of the story of our game is not linked to the interaction of the player. So for example, if we just click on play, as you can see by default, the Unity timeline will play, but it will not stop and not wait for the player to perform a certain action, which is what we want, of course. So before I forget, I want these 2 asteroids to not just spawn from somewhere. So a little technique that I'm going to do is select the trash can We can press on Ctrl D to duplicate it, and there it is. We can then go to the capsule and simply delete it. And I'm going to call this one Space Vacuum. Beautiful. And move the duplicate trash can over there at the middle of the desk. I'm going to then rotate it 180 degrees like so, and put it to the top right there. There you go. And now what we can do is put the two asteroids inside here, the space vacuum, so that when they will be instantiated by here our timeline, they will drop in front of the players on top of the desk. So let me just grab this one and put it over there. Okay, here you go. So now the big question is, how can we make it so that the timeline will not play automatically till the end and that will wait for the player's inputs? And to do so, the first step is to stop the timeline. And the technique that we will use is to simply use another signal emitter on the timeline to just pause it. So you should know how to do this. Let's right click, signal track, then go to our narrative story. We can then add a signal receiver. Beautiful. We can then go here on the signal receiver and create a new signal, which I will call stop timeline. Beautiful. We can then drag the signal receiver over there. And for the reaction, I'm going to click on the plus button, then navigate to the no function here, playable director, and then pause. Beautiful. And finally, the last thing we need to do is to simply stop the timeline when we want to wait for a player's interaction. So for example, over there, after the end of the third voice line, I want the player to grab the meteor and to put it in the trash can. So let's right click, add a signal emitter. We can drag it at the end of the voice line. And for the emit signal, let's select the stop timeline. Beautiful. Now we can simply copy the timeline and paste it on the others. And so our next interaction is to use the gun on the big asteroid. So let's simply copy here the stop timeline and paste it at the end over there. Beautiful. Now the next stop timeline is after here, the fifth one, which is when we are analyzing the cube. Now the next one is when the players reach the control room. So I can put it at the end over there of the sixth voice line. And finally, the last one is when the players manage to navigate the spaceship to the space teleporter over there. So let's place it at the end of the seventh. And there you go. Now, as you can see, we have here the 5 timeline stopper that will stop playing the timeline and wait for the player's interaction. Now, of course, if we click on play, let's see if it stops correctly. We go to our timeline, select something before the timeline stopper, and then press on play.
Scrap. Throw it into the quantum black hole interstellar trash can on the left.
As you can see, it works. By default, it has automatically paused the timeline. So now, the last step that we need to do is to play the timeline back once the player has done a particular interaction. So let's see how we can do this. Okay, so to do so, I'm going to select the narrative story game object that we made earlier. I'm going to create a new component that we can call play steps. Beautiful. Now, as the name suggests, the goal of this component will be to create a couple of steps and that we will be able to trigger at any time. Now, this step will correspond to a certain action and a certain time on the timeline that we have. So let's go at the top and add using Unity engine.playables. Beautiful. Now that we have this namespace, we can add a playable director called director, and we can get it at the start of the game with director equals get component of type playable director. There you go. Now let's create a custom class here inside this play step function that will be able to hold all of the data in a steps. To do so, let's create a public class, step, and inside this class, I want 3 things: a public string called name, which will be the name of the steps that we are using to identify it better, then a public float called time, and finally a public bool called as played equals false. There you go. Now we can go at the top and add a public list of steps that we can call steps. Now if we save and go back to Unity, as you can see, we cannot see any steps here and we cannot set them up in the Unity Inspector. And this is because we need to go at the top of the step class and add system.serializable. There you go. Now, if we go back to Unity once again, there it is. We can see the step game object. And as you can see, you will be able to add all of the steps information here. But anyway, now let's finish with our script. If we can remove here the update function, and instead I'm going to add a public void called play step index that will take as a parameter a int index. Now with this parameter, we should be able to get the target step with steps and get the corresponding steps index. Now we should make sure that the steps has not played yet. And if it has not played yet, we can set the step.hasPlayed to true. We can then stop the director with director.stop, set the director time to be the step.time, and then automatically play the director with director.play. Now, by doing so, as you can see, we'll make sure that the steps only play once with the hasPlayed here, and then we will be able to set the timeline at a particular time, which is the time of the step that we want to trigger, and then play automatically the director after that. Now everything is done, we can save and go back to Unity. Now is the time to set up all of the steps of our game. Now, if you remember, we have 5 of them that we can see on the timeline. So let's add 3 new over there. The first one is the throw in trash. The second one is the break meteor with gun. The third one is to analyze the cube. The next one is to go to control room. And the final one is to navigate to the space teleporter with the spaceship. Now for the time, this is the time that should be set on the timeline after the action is performed. So if we look at the throw in trash, it should begin at the start of the fourth voice line, which is this value. So let's copy it, go back to the narrative story and paste it over there. Now for the break meteor with gun, the voice line after this action is this one, which is 52 over there. For the analyze of the cube, the start of the time is this one. So let's paste it. To go to the control room is this time frame. So let's paste it again. And finally, after we navigate the space teleporter, it is the outro timeline, which is this one right there, and that we can paste as well at the end. And beautiful, everything is now done. The last thing we need is to hook and call play steps based on the action that the players perform. So let's do this with the first interaction, which is throw the asteroid in the trash can. Now, if you remember, under our trash can, we have this capsule, which has a trigger zone. And remember, I told you that this script will be important in the futures, and the future has come because we are going to use it. Now, when the meteors enter the trash can, what we can simply do is click on the plus button, drag our narrative story, and select the play steps index, and here set the play steps index to be 0, which means that we successfully managed to finish these steps. Now the next step was to break the meteor. So if we go back to the meteor, which is the spaceways breakable, we can add here a custom action by going inside a breakable script. So at the top, let's add using Unity engine.events. And let's add a public Unity event called on break. Okay, once we've created the Unity event for the break, we can simply go under here the break function. And just before setting the game object to false, let's do on break.invoke. There you go. Okay, beautiful. Now we can save and go back to Unity to just set up the Unity event for the on break. There you go. We can go back now to Unity. Click on the plus button, drag our narrative story, then go to the play steps index and select the play steps index 1. Beautiful. Now the next step was to analyze the energy cube. So let's select here our energy analyzer. And on the socket interactor, we can go to the interactor events. And on the select enter, click on the plus button. Then we can drag again on narrative story, play step index and write 2. Beautiful. Okay, so the next step is a bit more complicated. It is enabling here the door to open and then going upwards here to the control room. But how should we know that the players has entered the control room? Now to do so, we can use the trigger zone component that we made earlier. So if we right click, go to 3D object and cube, this will create a 3D cube as you can see. We can scale it up like so, there we go, and make it fit the size of our control room. We can remove the mesh renderer and the mesh filter as we only want to have here the box collider. Beautiful. Now this seems to fit well. Next step is to add the trigger zone component that we made in the second episode of this tutorial series. It was a long time ago, I know. Now anyway, this component needs a trigger collider, so we can set the box collider to be its trigger, and it needs a particular target tag. Now remember that on the XR origin, we have a collider that is hidden within the character controller. As you can see, this is a capsule collider that will follow the player and that we can use to know if the players has entered a trigger zone. So what we can do is set here the player to a certain tag. Now, as you can see, I've already have a player tag, which I can set. Otherwise, you can create the player tag by clicking on add tag. And now what's left is to go to the cube, set the target tag to be the player. We can also rename this cube control room trigger the zone. And finally, we can do the same as before, which is click on play, drag the narrative story, then go to play steps index, and we want the index to be the third one. But if we keep it this way, it will not work, because if you are using a trigger zone, which use a trigger collider, to have the trigger even worked, one of the two game objects needs to have a rigid body. But unfortunately, if we go to our XR origin, it has no rigid body. And I don't want to add any rigid body to the XR origin as it can create some weird physical bug. So anyway, what we can do is simply select our control room, click on add component and add here our rigid body. And as it will basically be on trigger box collider, it will do nothing and never move. So don't worry about any weird collision with it. And finally, the last thing we need to do is to make sure that the spaceship has entered the space vortex that we can see if we go a bit further into the timeline right there. So to do so, I'm going to do the same as the control room. So we can simply duplicate the control room trigger zone and rename it space teleporter trigger zone. We can, instead of the third index, write 4 here. We can then move here this space teleporter trigger zone near our vortex over there. We can even maybe reshape it a bit better. There we go. Now this way we will be able to know when the players has entered this zone, which means that he will be able to navigate the spaceship all the way to the vortex. Okay guys, and something dumb that I noticed is that I forgot here to uncheck the use gravity for the rigid body, which if I click on play, which as you can see make the trigger zone fall indefinitely. So what we can do is simply select the one that is under the space outside as well, and to simply make sure that use gravity is set to false. Now anyway, let's click on play to test our awesome game.
Day 117, we are still stuck in this space void. According to our calculations, the food reserves will allow you to survive for another 15 hours. Good luck. Attention, a new arrival of space matter has been caught by the slurp system. That's just some space scrap. Throw it into the quantum black hole interstellar trash can on the left. Attention, new arrival of space matter. This one is too big for the quantum black hole interstellar trash can. Grab and use the disintegrator. What's this sparkling anomaly? Interesting, we need further informations. Place it into the Doom Nuclear Void Spectrum Analyzer. Congratulations, you found a new energy source. According to my calculation, that's enough to power the beer cooler or restart the engines, your choice. Doors unlocked.
And there you go, guys. Our narrative story is now working with the timeline. Our timeline is playing the voice line and then waits for the player's action. This is crazy to me to see how everything comes to life now, and the result is just mind-blowing. Now we are almost at the end. 2 more episodes to go, and in the next one we are going to add a start menu to our game. So make sure to subscribe, and if you'd like to support my work and get access to the Result Unity project, I will leave my Patreon in the description below. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Bye bye.